When you remember how our discussion of contextualism went when it came to skepticism and how it was supposed to solve the problem the argument from ignorance posed, it's actually straightforward enough to see as well how contextualism is going to help with the lottery. Because actually the response is basically the same in both cases. So let's remember quickly what we said about the argument from ignorance. There we said that in ordinary contexts, it's true that you know you have hands, and in skeptical contexts, it's false that you know that you're not a brain in a vat. And what generally happens is that thinking about the proposition that you're a brain in a vat will tend to push you from ordinary contexts into skeptical contexts. Further, we saw that in ordinary contexts, it looks like it's true to say of you that you know that you're not a brain in a vat. The problem is that the moment you consider that claim, you automatically get moved into a skeptical context where it's false. So, in ordinary contexts, it's true that you know that you're not a brain in a vat. It's just that that knowledge is elusive, as Lewis puts it. Considering it tends to move you into a context where the claim is false instead. And the explanation in the lottery case is exactly the same. So on the contextualist view of the lottery, it is true in ordinary contexts that you know ordinary propositions. It is true that you know things like you're going to be in class later today. It is true that I know in ordinary contexts that I'm going to be going to dinner with my wife tonight. And even Alice, in ordinary contexts, knows that she's not going to be going on safari this year. It's also true that in ordinary contexts, she knows she's not going to win the lottery. Because in ordinary contexts, we seem only to be considering worlds where things go as they normally do. So for instance, in the safari case, we only seem to be considering worlds where she doesn't win the lottery, where she gets paid in the normal way, nothing funny happens to her paycheck. And so when those are the set of relevant situations, when those are the relevant possible worlds for whether you count as knowing, it looks like she knows she's not going to win the lottery, because those scenarios are just not relevant in the first place, so she doesn't have to rule them out. We then have to explain, well, what's going on with our intuitions about lottery propositions. Why do we have the intuition that we don't know them? And here the explanation goes back to salience. So remember before with heavyweight propositions, we saw the contextualist says that considering heavyweight propositions tends to move you into a context where you don't count as knowing them. It's very easy to see that the same kind of reasoning should apply to the lottery. We would expect that considering lottery propositions would tend to move you into contexts where worlds where you win the lottery are now relevant, because of course you're going to be considering them. Now, as we'll see in a few moments, Hawthorne doesn't think that attention is quite the right way to think about it, but it does seem that the essential idea here, that in lottery contexts, lottery propositions make worlds where you win the lottery relevant by making them salient, that core of the explanation does seem to be plausible and the kind of thing the contextualist should say. So summarizing, the explanation here is just the same as in the argument from ignorance. In ordinary contexts, you count both as knowing the ordinary proposition and the lottery proposition. When you start explicitly considering lottery propositions, however, you're then moved into a context where you don't count as knowing the lottery proposition, and for that reason you also don't count as knowing ordinary propositions, because we're assuming that closure holds. One thing that's interesting about Hawthorne's discussion is that he does bring out that a certain feature of Lewis's explanation of what's going on with the argument from ignorance, and something which will also carry over to the lottery, can't be quite right. So we talked a lot about the rule of attention last time. And the rule of attention said that when you're attending to a possibility, when you're paying attention to a particular possible world, it automatically becomes relevant. One thing that Hawthorne points out is that that actually seems a bit too strong. There are cases where you seem to be attending to certain possible worlds, and yet those possible worlds don't seem relevant, or they don't seem relevant in the sense that we're using in spelling out a contextualist theory of knows. So Hawthorne has this very nice case where he says, imagine that you're watching the movie The Matrix. So part of what's happening in the world of The Matrix is that all of us think that we're in the actual world, but really we're in these pods, in these farms where people are being used to generate energy, and we're just being stimulated in the ways that we imagine brains and vats are being stimulated. So it looks to us like we're living in the 20th century, the 20th century then, the 21st century now. But in fact, this is all a computer program that we're all taking part on were all really people in these pods, in these horrible robot farms in the middle of nowhere. Now Hawthorne says, well, think about when you're watching The Matrix. You're obviously paying attention to worlds where everybody is a pod person. You are paying attention to a certain kind of skeptical scenario when you're watching The Matrix. But does that automatically push you into a context where you want to now say, oh, maybe after all, I don't know that I have hands? And it looks like the answer is no. Just watching the movie The Matrix doesn't make you a skeptic. Now, it might be the case that afterwards, once you start doing a little bit of reasoning afterwards, you might then become inclined towards skeptical reasoning. But just watching the movie by itself doesn't seem to put you in the skeptical mindset. And this is problematic for Lewis's rule, because on Lewis's rule, this is what we would expect. We would expect that watching the movie The Matrix should automatically push you into a context where claims about ordinary propositions become false. Insofar as that doesn't seem to be the case, that's a kind of problem for the rule of attention. Now, it's unclear whether it's a really serious problem, because the basic sort of idea behind the rule of attention does seem to be getting at something importantly right. It does seem like something like attention tends to make worlds relevant, or at least attention plus something else. And it looks like the whatever the something else is probably going to be present in the kinds of skeptical and lottery cases that we've talked about so far. But it is worth thinking through Hawthorne's case about The Matrix and seeing that attention by itself is not quite the right notion. Really, the right idea seems to be what you might call salience, that there's something we can do to possibilities, namely we can raise them to salience. And sometimes paying attention to them does that, but maybe not always. So there's going to be a project of figuring out what salience is, but it seems like the details are correct enough in ordinary skeptical context that we can appeal to something like Lewis's explanation of what's going on.